You enter the room, and there's a large, scaled beast, standing 25 foot tall, sharp fangs. He looks at you and roars, and in the mouth of this giant creature is a bright red eye staring back at you. What do you do?
I charge in. I take my sword and I just charge in
All
and I
right,
attack him.
roll for initiative.
All right. 20.
Wow. All right, so it's your turn to attack again, Chris.
All right. I miss. We've
Well,
been at it for like what, 2 hours? Like,
yeah,
is
but
it almost dead?
yeah, so I mean, you haven't really targeted the weak spot. Remember, he's roaring. There's a red eye.
All right. So I need to hit the one thing again. I attack the red eye.
Yeah.
19.
You hit.
All right.
First hit.
First hit.
A good combat can be the most memorable moment in a campaign.
But there's some pits and falls that you need to avoid as a game master. Hi, I'm Chris.
And I'm Matt.
Welcome to Roleplay Chat.
We're two game masters who just cannot stop talking about role-playing games.
Today we talk about encounter building, some basic where we start, and some aspect we consider. This is probably going to be a multi-part subject. So today is only the surface level.
Yeah, we originally actually, before even filming this episode, had a few ideas of what we wanted to talk about, but then told ourselves it doesn't really make sense to dig too deep into those subjects that are related to combat without giving a whole kind of surface level discussion first, which will be filled with, I think, a lot of cool insights anyway. But that's kind of the background for this episode, really. We're going to be talking about things like what are the game master's intentions when they're coming up with a combat or an encounter.
Objectives that arises from this motivation that the GM has.
We're also going to be talking about the circumstances that surround the combat, why it's happening, where it's happening, etc.
And what percentage or what fraction of how this encounter should be tackled we prepare in advance.
I think we're ready for this conversation, Chris.
Let's do it, Matt.
Let's
Role
role
play
play
chat. Today we'll start in the order we create encounters. So, Matthew, what do you start with when you create an encounter?
Yeah, so when I'm creating an encounter, it the first thing I do is decide what this encounter is for. What are my intentions as a game master? Why is there a fight here? And that can be kind of varied, and it kind of depends on the situation. But we can kind of categorize these into a few different groups. And I think the same applies for you, right, Chris?
Yeah, we had a little discussion before, and we basically have the same starting point. I think two big categories are the encounters that are plot relevant and that can be further divided, and the what we've been calling the interrupts that are mostly side quests or quests that are not relevant to the main plot or the main villain or stuff like that.
They could be sometimes are synonymous with, like random encounters that happen when traveling or sleeping or things like that. Sometimes have a little bit less purpose to them. I think you and I, Chris, agree that they should still have some relevance, but for the most part, they're a little bit more spontaneous.
Yeah. So we'll maybe talk a bit less about those interrupts because it's less based on the GM motivation, but more on a need in the story to just have this combat punctuation. But let's say we have an encounter that you want. So there's different situation where you know an encounter will emerge, and that's whenever the players want to acquire something. So they want to acquire the gem for whatever reason, this evil artifact. It doesn't make for a good story that they get there and they just get it.
Yeah, there needs to be some kind of obstacle, and usually I think the most fun is when you have a big monster or a collection of cultists. There's some kind of barrier that the players need to overcome to obtain this artifact, ruby, treasure map, what have you. And that's where, because of where the story is going in the combat, in the campaign, it makes sense for the players to have this obstacle placed in front of them.
Yeah, often that means that the players will have a strategic upper hand because they can be able to plan, they can ambush, they can do research and stuff like that. On the other hand, there's the one where the villain has a plan and the characters stumble onto the plan or try to stop him or her. So that sometimes the encounter may vary in that regard. So the first thing, once you have this motivation, once you have the intention behind it,
Yeah.
what's the next step?
So the next step for me, I especially lately have been trying to focus a lot on making combat have a deeper depth than just kill the bad guy or kill the enemies or survive. Like those can be perfectly fine reasons for a fight to happen, but usually there are objectives that I want to present to my players. It could be, you see a sink, you see a ship, and you need to sink the ship, in addition to surviving. Or there's a hostage that was taken. Can't you say, like, you're going and you're trying to save the hostage? It adds a layer of complexity to combat that I think makes it more fun. And player choice. I want to try to give my players, within the combat, decisions that they might need to make.
Yeah, I've been playing in your game for a while, and like it's decision, but it's not just which door and which monster you're gonna kill, but also what you want to prioritize, right? Is it
Exactly.
saving your friend, or is it helping your captain, or is it so basically testing the values of your character to so that you have to make a decision that will affect the story, but also flesh out what are your priorities as a character, and sometimes that the team might disagree on what to do.
So that's how I incorporate objectives and choices into combat, and at least at a high level. I don't totally flesh them out quite yet, but that's kind of my second element that I consider. How about you, Chris? What place do objectives and choices have in your games?
They're very to the core of every encounter. So once I know what's my intention, it's normally an objective comes out of it, like emerges, and I build everything around it. So that's the first thing for me that's really important. You mentioned those multiple objective. I think that's one great way to do it. I do it sometime like that where the objectives are parallel. I feel like it's choices that are all equally valid. I like to do it the other way too, where it's vertical. I don't know why I see it vertical, but in series, it's almost a level of achievement. So there would be, let's say, you need to retrieve that dagger. So that's the baseline of like, have you succeeded or failed? But often I have another level,
Secondary objectives.
secondary
Yeah,
objective
those
that
are
might
fun.
be saving someone. Often it's a treasure room that might be harder to get to. So once you get the main thing, you're there. You know your characters are there to retrieve this evil dagger, and you know there's other villain coming. That's when you choose: are we sticking there for more time to search and maybe find treasure, or are we getting the hell out of there?
Yeah.
So that happened to me a couple of times, and I tend to make those complementary objective harder to get.
Something that I think we should mention here, Chris, when we have these things that are harder to get, I think a mistake that people might make is translates harder to get to just more HP that you're going to lose. I
Mm,
I
yeah.
I disagree with that.
Hmm.
If that's how you run your games and your players enjoy it and you're enjoying it, by all means keep doing it. But I think if you add an extra layer of complexity where it's harder to get because you needed to interrogate and capture one of the enemies and get that information from them, or find a key somewhere that you use in the combat to unlock a special chest, or what have you. Those are these layered objectives that become harder and harder to acquire through really creative solutions that your players hopefully come up with or detour around, or what have you.
Yeah, and sometimes in order for them to be more difficult, it needs to be time sensitive, I feel. Uh, the dungeon is collapsing. So it's like, are we taking the time to use the key we found? But it might cause more problem.
Yeah.
So things like that I really like, and we've been talking about investigating and maybe questioning, but sometimes that can be out of an encounter. But right now we're talking about encounter building, so we're talking about having
Yeah,
to do this
in the fight.
while the fight is going on. It's finding challenges that are interesting while combat is happening. So that adds so much um, depth to what's going on.
So with this approach, and with any approach, when I'm considering objectives, and I'm sure it's the same for you, Chris, we're thinking about what's the reward for succeeding. If the objective is to obtain the dagger, well, the reward for succeeding in that case is they get the dagger, for instance. But when we have these side objectives or these additional layers in the combat, if you have stuff for your players to put themselves at risk for, there should be something that they're getting out of it.
Yeah.
You have to consider rewards.
Equipment, money, even XP, if that makes sense in your system. There's different other thing, more information, some reveal, clues.
Yeah,
I
plot elements, like you're saying. Maybe the additional thing that they find is a notebook, an enemy's notebook, or a secret letter that they can look into. Can really advance the plot in an interesting way. Maybe it gives them a further advantage to know the insights of the enemies next time they're going to fight them.
Yeah.
Or to avoid a fight altogether.
Yeah, and a good example of that, I don't want to spend the whole episode saying examples, so if you want to go see the next Blood and Betrayal for next week, the encounter was built with multiple level of success, equipment, information, so that would be a good place to go for a full-fledged example on those level of success.
Absolutely. And then when you talk about success, you also have to consider failure. And I'm not saying plan whether your players are going to succeed or fail. I'm just saying have both of those options available to you, because you need to know, if they don't get something or they don't save the hostage or whatever, what's going to happen next.
Yeah, because a big mistake sometimes people do is they base the story around a success. If they don't get, let's say, the dagger, if they don't get the dagger, then the story goes nowhere. They failed at the whole thing. So it's good to have a backdoor of how are they actually going to fix it. Reinforcement come and helps them. That's maybe good once on a campaign. You can't use that multiple times. So you have to find interesting ways to maybe help them, or just flat out have a consequence of not basically a failing. So.
And I think because we're still talking about us planning the objectives of the combat. I think it's the game master's, it's our responsibility to make sure that the objective that the players are trying to achieve isn't so critical that it has to happen. Because if you're setting something that your players, without obtaining the dagger or without saving the hostage or without doing whatever it is, completely fail and
negates the rest of the story,
negates the whole plot, or it'll take them 5 game sessions to kind of fumble around to catch back up, I think that's a mistake.
A good way to do it is you keep moving forward, but with consequences. NPC interaction. It depends. It depends a lot on what you're trying to do, but keep it moving forward. That's what I try to do.
Yeah, and so like you're saying, a way to move forward, NPC death. loss of equipment.
Yeah.
Um, I think really digging into the backstories of your players can can be a source of inspiration for failure here, because if one person has like a shield that was passed down to them over generations or whatever, and that shield means a lot to them, and now they lose it, maybe the main plot line doesn't get too affected, but that hero is sure going to be affected,
Hmm.
and the player is going to have opportunities within that failure to role play, to look for a new shield, maybe to seek vengeance to get it back, and you kind
Hmm.
of you open up doors even with that failure, and I think that's something we should try and strive to do.
Yeah, and another good tool is recurring villains, right? So the shield might be now in the hands of the enemy, and when they meet him again or her, now the character that you've based your story around that shield can be even more involved, and that
Mm-hmm.
creates good story.
The next step in our brains when we're creating combat as game masters is to then think about the circumstances that lead up to and like are part of this combat.
Yeah, so now you know why you're doing this encounter. You're doing what you want to have as an objective. Now we have to think about the what's going on, the how this encounter is going to go.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
The elements that surround it, the elements that lead up to it,
exactly.
and really like the circumstances of the combat in combat.
Yeah. So if you have your story, you might at this point have a good idea of the faction that'll be in play.
Mm-hmm.
Is it going to be the bandit they've been encounter? Is it going to be demons? So if the motivation, your intention is clear, often the faction will be clear,
Mm-hmm.
and then we'll start. You'll need to start about thinking about NPCs and stuff like that.
Another thing that kind of surrounds your circumstances is the location, right? So where it is it in the sewers of a city? Is it in a cave in the forest? Is it in the basement of a tavern? All of these elements really start to get put together once you know
The rest,
the rest.
yeah, and sometimes it might be very clear that a location will be in your mind. That happens to me often. I'm like, I know where the location is going to be. But
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you're like, oh, it's more about a piece of information I want them to have a chance to gather. So that encounter could be at multiple spots. So then that's where I would make the decision of where sometimes I actually don't make the decision. It's like I assume they're going to go somewhere and my encounter is going to be at that spot.
Mm-hmm.
So that's if you prepare a map and stuff like that, it's harder. But sometimes the location will not be fixed, but often it is.
And this is where your interrupts can come into play,
Yeah.
right? If there isn't a specific location that this event is tied to, why not spring it on your players
Hmm.
when they're camping or traveling? It could spice that up
Yeah.
quite a bit.
We're not going to go in details on how to create a good environment or how to like what creatures to bring. This is going to be in a probably
Mm-hmm.
later.
But it's definitely something that we consider.
Yeah.
So if you're creating your circumstances, you're gonna want to think about, okay, if it's happening in the basement of a tavern, what are the things that are the players can engage with? What are the elements that are moving, that maybe time sensitive, etc., etc. You're thinking about the creating an environment that's really really engaging for your players to fight in, and then the other element that we're not going to dig too much into right now, but hopefully we'll get a chance to, is really piecing together like the pawns of the fight, like
Hmm.
who's in the fight, which enemies, what are their powers, these kinds of things.
Yeah. And the last thing, once you figured out mostly who's going to be there and where, uh, is I like to think of possible surprises. Um, are they? Is it going to be reinforced by the enemy? Are they going to get reinforced by allies?
Mm.
What kind of reveal do you expect to happen and where? Sometimes I like to think of cool moments, possible cool moments. I'm like, whenever this gonna happen, someone's gonna show up with a thunder and, and gonna appear, and then the players go, oh, and you don't know when it's gonna happen, but you have it in your
Yeah.
back pocket, and sometimes it won't come up, but most of the time that creates memorable moments.
So when you're thinking about surprises and reinforcements, also, I think it's important to consider the realism impact, like how realistic is it given these circumstances for
Mm-hmm.
reinforcements to happen. You can't just decide, oh, reinforcements are going to happen, but you're in a wizard's tower on a little island, like super far away, and there isn't really way for reinforcements to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's something that you might be considering for the combat, you need to also consider the circumstances that it's in. So if you were hoping to have reinforcements happen, you might want to change the location to a place where it's actually possible for reinforcements to come.
Mm-hmm. So once I have all the moving parts, one thing I like to do, an exercise I do at the end, is because I don't want to like run like simulate the combat on my own because that would take way too long. I start to think about the different ways I expect the players to tackle. Do you do that? To tackle the situation.
Um, yes, it's more about which tools I expect them to use within a combat.
Okay.
I'll let you extrapolate a little bit more on this one, Chris.
All right. So for me, having this exercise is about figuring out different ways to attack their problem. Let's say they want to steal a necklace, and there's three floors. Are they gonna climb at the exterior? Are they gonna sneak in? Are they gonna try to charm their way in? Are they gonna hire mercenaries?
Mm-hmm.
Different aspect. And I think of all of these, and my way, it's just to make sure my encounter is interesting enough that it cannot be just hacked and slashed, and it cannot be like I like a if they just want to stealth in,
Mm-hmm.
that's great because that's risky. But I try to set up the stage so that all of these are possible ways to do it that are equally fun, and that it's not restricted to one thing of like you open the door, you move, you kill that guy, and then you get the treasure. Different ways to have the players use their creativity to tackle the problem.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I agree with you entirely, Chris. I know that something that people tend to say not to do actually is to plan how
Yeah,
the
and
fight's going to go, and we're not saying plan how the fight has to go.
no.
What we're saying really is you use that as a creative tool because you're thinking about it, and
Hmm.
I do too. It actually almost inspires me, I want to say, to add elements,
Yeah.
because I'll start with saying, okay, the enemy's here, they're going to fight them. What if they don't want to fight them?
Hmm. What if they run away?
Okay, so how do I add to this combat, to this scenario, to the environment, to whatever? If they run away, it's still interesting, it's still engaging, and it's
Hmm.
still hard. Hard enough, or it's still at the difficulty I want it to be.
Hmm.
Um, okay, now they're fighting or running away. Next thing, like you said, what if they want to charm them? Okay,
Is
blah
that
blah
a
blah 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 blah.
possibility? It
Is
might
it
not
possible?
be,
Mm-hmm.
but if you thought about it, it won't catch you off guard. But what I love that happens a lot of time is I think of I don't know three, four, five ways even,
Mm-hmm.
and when the players think of something I haven't thought of, that's when I'm like, oh, now that's interesting
That's cool.
because I have all the moving pieces and I didn't think of that thing, and it's smart. It's uh, it's very interesting, and then that's when I would possibly give bonuses, and I won't like once I've done the exercise and I've planned my stuff, I won't change it a lot. If they sneak up a place I didn't plan and they enter and they steal a thing and they leave, I didn't think about it. So they should get the reward. I don't want to artificially prevent them from achieving the thing
Mm-hmm.
because they found an interesting way to do it.
Another thing that's I find a lot of fun to do when I'm thinking about how my players are going to tackle a problem is to give them things within the confines of the combat that I'm not actually sure how they're going to use
Hmm.
it. Maybe
Yeah.
they don't use it. Maybe there's no advantage to using a specific item that's in the room, like something they can interact with or whatever. But I like to throw these things in, pepper them into the space because, like you said, players can be really creative.
Yeah, it's almost like seeding like a tool.
Yeah.
Like there's a barrel with black powder in it. Are they going to use it? They don't know that it's black powder, but maybe they figure it out. Maybe they
Yeah,
do a good test, and now you're like, yeah, it's black powder, but you don't. They don't need to use it. It's just there.
exactly. And this is kind of makes full circle with our intro.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's so tempting to say, okay, there's going to be this really cool big bad guy. She's going to have this super cool power, but the only way to kill her is if you launch the barrel of black powder and make it explode right at her feet because she has weak feet and is afraid is like super vulnerable to fire and explosives.
Hmm. But that's the only way.
But that's the only way to kill her.
Hmm.
That's something I like to call the Zelda effect, where there was the bad guy with the big tentacles and he had little like targets in his hands, and the only way to defeat the bad guy was by shooting at the targets, and that's it.
Yeah, a lot of video games are guilty of that thing where you have the big monster where okay, he's gonna swing, I'm gonna dodge, and then I have to attack him. I have like 2 seconds to attack him, and then do this thing all over again.
Uh-huh.
Right?
It's and the problem really appears when it's the only way to do it.
Hmm.
I think you do add cool layers of complexity, and you can even reward your players.
Yeah.
If they did research and they find out that trolls are super weak to fire, great. Let them use that information to have an easier fight.
Yeah.
But don't make it impossible to win. Otherwise, it's just going to get boring. You'll be stuck there fighting a troll regenerating itself all night long. So something that we should also mention here, Chris, is when we're planning our combats, when you're planning your combats, something you should be doing throughout the entirety is setting difficulty and being aware of what that difficulty is.
Yes, depending on their circumstances, it can vary a lot. But to start with, you need to have an idea of are we challenging? Is the goal to challenge the characters, or it's just like a little encounter they have to deal with?
Mm-hmm.
Depending on the system, a smaller encounter might have different effects. In D&D, it's a lot about using resources. In Warhammer, is even small encounters you can hit a critical and have to deal with it for a long time. So depending on your system, you need to know your system in order to use them properly. But once
Yeah.
you have this difficulty, then you can kind of compare to everything you set up in the combat.
Exactly. And be aware that this baseline difficulty that you're setting for the combat can be altered very easily by player actions, by player choices, and by player preparation. So these are things that you should be kind of keeping in mind in your preparation for the combat. Because, like we said, if there's different hows to address this problem, and we can only come up with a finite number of them, I'm sure our players come up with several others, as they always do, it makes it so that the difficulty you thought this was going to have is going to change. And I think it's a good game master's responsibility to allow that flexibility, to reward or punish depending on the actions that the players took to prepare for something.
Yeah, and I think it's often better depending on your group, but I like to use the carrot and less the stick in terms of if let's say I had a medium encounter in mind and they plan very well, it becomes easy, no problem, I'll let them have it.
Mm-hmm.
But if for bad roll, not necessarily bad planning, but for bad, they have bad rolls, bad luck, sometimes something that's out of your game master control, and sometimes you didn't think it would be that hard.
Yeah.
You set the difficulty to average in your head, and it's way harder than you thought because of whatever attribute the monster has or whatever. Then that's when it's like it's not their fault. I
Mm-hmm.
might pull my punches a little bit.
Absolutely.
So if they do good planning, I don't tend to like punish them for having good planning to bring it back to average. The only time I would do that is to have the climax of a story still be interesting. So if you have a big monster you've been building towards for months and then they have the big combat, they do
Mm-hmm.
great planning or they very lucky to critical after critical and your big bad guy would just die, then that's when I might be like, well, this is anticlimactic, so maybe it dies, but it raises again
Mm-hmm.
as an even bigger monster, or their reinforcement to protect them, or whatever you want to make it harder. But I think that's the only time I would bring it back is if it was way too easy for the intensity you wanted.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So I think that covers most of the elements of combat anyway.
Yeah.
Let's maybe recap them all.
So the first thing we need to figure out is what's the intention behind the combat? What's the motivation as a game master to create this encounter? And from this, you have an objective that emerges, main objective, and we talked about having different parallel objective or different level of success.
And then you have to think about rewards, right? If you're going to talk about having objectives for your players, you want to think about what kind of things they're going to get out of meeting those objectives. If there's layers, having multiple rewards, money, XP, magic items, information can all be elements of those rewards. Then we also spoke briefly about failure. You have to consider the cost of failure. And then that segued towards the circumstances.
Yeah, so what are the faction in play? Where is it going to happen? What about surprises? Are they gonna? Is there going to be reinforcement? Stuff like that. Then we thought about the how. So not limiting ways to tackle the problem, the encounter, but just have a mental exercise of thinking: are they going to sneak past the monster? Are they charge in? Are they going to charm their way through it? And think of all of that might create ideas for you to incorporate in the encounter to make it more dynamic and interesting.
Yeah, and to make sure that although you're thinking about how they might address the different problems you present to them within the encounter, never make those the only way to solve the problem. Always give your players the flexibility to come up with their own creative solutions, and don't punish them for coming up with said solution. And that covers pretty much everything we talked about today. I'd like to thank you for listening. Thank you for tuning in. Now we have a pretty cool, fancy new microphone that Chris got it for his birthday, and I'm hoping it's making a difference.
And that we don't capture the sound around.
Yeah, sorry if you can hear my daughter talking up a storm upstairs. And yeah, and that's most of it. I guess we also have a community question for you guys out there who are listening. We encourage you to answer down below or to reach out to us on Twitter. You can contact us at roll_play_chat on Twitter.
Or if you want to write an email, we have contactroleplaychat@gmail.com.
And we'd love to hear your favorite combats, the elements that you include in your combat, and maybe what was one of the best combat scenarios you've ever had the pleasure of participating in.
Or even just a cool aspect of one combat, one memorable location, situation, monster.
Yeah, so we'd like to thank you again for listening. Thank you for tuning in. And please comment, like, and subscribe. It actually makes a pretty big difference. I'm finding out this algorithm might be put up against us. So if you can help us out, any little bit helps. And if you're listening to us on audio, we're now available on Apple Podcasts. I'm not sure if I've mentioned that already, but I'm pretty excited about that. It's a pretty big audience for us to reach out to there. And I think my daughter is calling me to go upstairs, so I think this is going to be where we wrap it up, Chris.
That's all, Matt.
Let's call it a chat.